All right, let's dive into a text called The Myth of the Self-Made Magnate. It really takes apart one of the biggest ideas in our culture. You know, the one that says anyone can get to the top if they just work hard enough. Let's see what it has to say.
So, we'll kick things off with a piece of advice you've probably heard a million times, right? It usually comes from the most successful people on the planet. And the message is super clear. Your success is all on you.
And this is the core of what the source calls the self-made story. It's that classic, powerful idea that all you really need is grit and ambition to make it big. But the text uses this familiar tale as a launchpad for a pretty serious critique. Now, this is where things get really interesting. The text asks this fascinating question. What if everybody who's ever been called poor or lazy actually did this? What if they all went all in, working as hard as they possibly could to get ahead? What would happen then?
And the text gives a really blunt answer. It argues that the whole world these magnates live in is only possible because most people aren't climbing that ladder. If everyone actually tried to, the entire system as they know it would just fall apart.
So the idea here is that the system isn't some wide-open field of opportunity. Nope. It's more like a maze, and it's got these ceilings built right in. Let's take a look at the specific barriers the text points out. And you can really see the clash of ideas right here. On the left, you've got the myth. It's all about how hard you work. But on the right, you see the reality the source describes. A system with wage ceilings where your pay hits a hard limit no matter what, and economic rules that are basically rigged from the get-go. This really gets to the core mechanics. The source is arguing that the whole thing is held up by the essential work of people who are systemically paid less than their worth. And at the same time, it claims that laws are being shaped by lobbying to protect the fortunes that already exist. You know, kind of pulling up the ladder behind them. Okay, so if the system is really set up this way, how do you justify that massive gap between the very top and everyone else? Well, according to this text, it all comes down to the story they tell themselves and us. And that story, the source claims, is all about being inherently superior. See, the wealthy aren't just lucky, they're supposedly smarter. They have this special economic intelligence, and they just make better life choices. It frames success not as a matter of opportunity, but as some kind of personal, almost genetic trait. So who actually believes they're just better? The source points to this very specific group, the 1.1%. It argues that this tiny, tiny fraction of the world's population, you know, the millionaires and billionaires, genuinely believes they're just more capable than everybody else. But the source really pushes back on this idea. It asks, on what basis can you possibly make that claim? Especially when you think about all the geniuses throughout history, in art and culture and science, who came from nothing and definitely weren't part of any economic elite. This brings us to a really, really important point in the argument. If huge wealth isn't just because of individual brilliance, then where does it come from? What's it actually built on? The text gives us this definition. The argument is that these giant fortunes don't just pop up out of nowhere. They are built on top of a foundation that was created over generations by the labor, the risks, and yeah, often the sacrifices and injustices faced by millions of ordinary people. And here's the kicker. It's a deep dependency. The source argues that the top of that pyramid is completely held up by the essential work of people at the bottom, the very same people who are often looked down on, or, as the source puts it, provocatively, viewed as a kind of subspecies. So if the system is that dependent on this structure, you have to figure it's got ways to protect itself, to keep things just the way they are. The source argues this doesn't happen by chance. There are real mechanisms at play. There's a quote in the text that just nails it. It is easy to give advice in a world where you make the rules. I mean, think about it. When you can literally shape the laws, influence the economy, and even create the demand for your products, that advice to work harder starts to sound a little different, doesn't it? You're not just a player in the game, you're the one setting the board. To put this idea to the test, the source suggests a little thought experiment. What if the super rich took the smartest, most capable kids from disadvantaged backgrounds and actually genuinely funded their education and careers? Would they create their own competition? The text doesn't mince words here. The answer is a hard no. The argument is that the whole point of the power structure isn't to create a real meritocracy. Why? Because genuine competition from below is a direct threat to the way things are. And this is why it's so important. The source claims that it's a known fact that most people, if you give them a good environment and a real shot, can totally transform their lives. So the goal isn't really to lift everyone up. It's to maintain the system that keeps the power right where it is.
So, after all that, where are we headed? The text wraps up by looking to the future, and specifically, how new technologies like AI could completely change the game.
And here's the progression the source lays out. First, it predicts technology will make the current gap even wider. Then, as AI and robots get more and more advanced, the essential labor from the masses, that foundation of wealth we talked about, could become totally unnecessary. They could just be replaced. And that leaves us with the text's final, pretty chilling question. For all of human history, wealth and power have been built on the labor of the many. So if that labor isn't needed anymore, what happens to the foundation? What does a world even look like when the 99% are no longer a necessary part of the economic equation? That is a provocative thought to end on.